Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me at the back?
Yes.
Good. Well, if you can't, just put your hand up. Concrete castles, the curator's talk. What is the curator's talk? Well, my talk is about art and wall. And I have four elements. I'm going to talk about, first off, about the origins of concrete castles, this rather unusual exhibition and its subject, concrete castles, because some of their ideas are emphasised in those origins for the show. Then I'm going to tell you about the war artist story in general, and in particular some of the artists who painted our subject, the fortifications in 1940, when they were new and ready for action. And then we'll look, as contrast, some of the approaches and ideas that the contemporary artists in this exhibition had, and some of their styles and where they were coming from. And then to put everything in context at the end, I'm going to tell you something of the history of summer 1940. Sadly, there won't be time to tell you everything, but we'll see how we go. In May 2017, Southampton City Art Gallery, one of the finest regional galleries in the country, staged a big exhibition on the subject of castles called Capture the Castle. On the front cover there, you see, and I have one in my hand here, big thick catalogue book, is a painting by J.M.W. Turner, Britain's world-class greatest artist. He loved castles. This is Norham Castle on the banks of the Dee, which he painted almost as many times as it was besieged by the Scots. And just a month before, I had left the employment of Southampton City Art Gallery after 37 years working in conservation, collections management, and as curator. I trained originally as a fine artist. I never stopped painting. So I came back the following month as a curator of this show and a participating artist. And the exhibition told the story of the castle from its arrival with William the Conqueror. He brought a flat pack with him, and Britain didn't have castles. Castles are partly fortress, partly lordly residence. And it's how William the Conqueror nailed the country down by building around about 500 within 50 years. And there were like sort of alien spaceships arriving. The natives hated them because they dominated their lives. The story told, the exhibition told the story of the castle and its military and architectural development in a sort of arms race with siege warfare techniques right up to the apex of the great Edwardian castles of North Wales. And I had the idea because in about 2011, I read a fantastic book by Mark Morris about Edward I, a great and terrible king. And I wanted to go and see his castle, so I persuaded my wife to go up and have a holiday there. We saw about 8. This is fantastic Harlech Castle. And I had the idea of perhaps painting castles, never done before, and perhaps it could be an exhibition. That's the way my mind works, being a museum curator. But for a long time, I thought, it's too boys' own, too specialist, it wouldn't have universal appeal. But boy, was I wrong. Talking to artist friends, I quickly realised the idea that actually it would be, a fantastic thing to do and would have wide appeal. And I sold the idea very quickly to the museums, to the exhibition manager at Southampton, and the exhibition was forged. And it included historic artists and contemporary artists telling this story through the artist's eyes, right up to the concentric defences of Edward I, which is a castle within a castle. That's Beaumaris and Harlech, for instance. And then after that comes the decline of the importance of the castle because the country becomes safe, and they change their role to status symbol. And they become sort of more around comfort, with the Renaissance coming up, and morphs into sort of the Tudor courthouse. And then the last hurrah of the castle and its military use during the Civil Wars, 1642 to 1651. But after that, castles are abandoned. They become ruinous, forgotten. Some limp on as administrative centres and town jails, but most of them are plundered for their stones to build other buildings, especially at Bilth Wells in Powys, where in 1690 there was a huge fire and the whole town burnt down, and the townsfolk plundered their huge castle to rebuild Builth Wells. In fact, right down to the last stone, there's nothing there now, just huge mounds. I think they shot themselves in the foot because they've lost their great tourist attraction that Carnarvon has, for instance. Great tragedy. So they're forgotten about until in the 18th century, the antiquarians and the artists rediscover them and put them back on the map. In the 1720s and 30s, Nathaniel and Samuel Buck, the two Buck brothers, engage in a huge survey of ruins in the country, abbeys and especially castles. It's often the first visual image we have of these places. And suddenly people sit up and take notice about the heritage across the country. And in conjunction with the Romantic movement, which is pan-European, again, the 18th century, and especially the picturesque movement, suddenly castles are in vogue as a major subject for art and artists. And this is especially promoted and championed by the famous vicar in the New Forest, William Gilpin, who painted this watercolour here. He came from an artistic family in the Lake District, trained as in theology at Oxford, became a curate, taught at Cheam School, the oldest school in the country, and became vicar of Boulder. And he travelled widely. His brother was the famous sporting artist, Saury Gilpin. He was an artist as well, and he travelled the Wye Valley, the Lake District, writing treatises about the picturesque landscapes. Picturesque means literally worthy of a painting. And his premise was that if the view you're looking at isn't quite beautiful enough, you can move bits around to make it even more beautiful. That we'd call that artist's license today. And if you can put a ruin, a castle or an abbey into the picture, it elevates the whole status of the painting. And here you can see several ruins. He's gone mad with it. He got lampooned and teased for it in 1911 by a big poem by William Coombs. But certainly the picturesque was a very popular movement in art in the 19th century. And here is a typical picturesque painting. It's in Southampton's collection by Paul Sandby, known as the father of English watercolour. The Eagle Tower, Carnarvon Castle, Edward I's great castle, which pins down the Welsh in northwest Wales. And behind you have the blue rolling hills, body of water, the framing tree device, starfish figures in the foreground giving interest, and the great castle as the centrepiece, a true picturesque painting. Turner took the picturesque to a whole new level. This again is Norham Castle, and he bigged it up. I've been there, it doesn't look like that. He's made it more dramatic. That's what Turner does with his work. And all the detail is dissolved in light. He became known as the painter of light. In fact, his apocryphal last words were, "The sun is God." And these works were ahead of his time. People didn't understand them, died in 1851. But the young Monet and the Impressionists saw these. He was on the run from the Franco-Prussian Wars, came to London, saw these works, and they influenced him in Impressionism, which is the birth of the modern movement. And the castles are part of that story, if you like. So after artists come and put castles back on the map in people's minds as a subject for art, that begats a whole new range of castle building in the 19th century, which is part of the Gothic revival in architecture movement. And this is one such bonkers example. This is Penrhyn Castle in North Wales, neo-Norman. The inside's hugely opulent. The natives hate it because this is slate money. The owner owned the slate mines, and all the sort of Welsh workers had to go and, work themselves to death. And he got the money and built this huge, strange, weirdly looking castle. It's got no military use at all, of course. It's about status. And this links to our story about World War II, because in fact, this is where most of the National Gallery's collection was taken for safekeeping in 1940. 1939. And the curator goes with it, writes back to the director, he says, this is hopeless. All the works have been put in the outhouses and the rain and rats get in, and the owner's always drunk. didn't stay there very long because quite soon after it went up more famously, you will probably know this, it went to the slate mines at Blaenau-Festiniog, where the environment there with the relative humidity being stable, the temperature being stable, the works were safe for the duration of the war. But that's where they first went to. The exhibition was opened by Christopher Lebrun here, who was at the time was president of the Royal Academy. So we had, big cheeses to come and see the show. And he's standing in front proudly of his two lovely watercolours, because we ended the show with fantasy castles. We went right up to Game of Thrones with the story, which was great fun. One artist, Julian Perry, national reputation, great guy, he's often on the television. He's been on the TV as an expert on Constable and Paul Nash. Asked me if he could paint for this show a pillbox. I said no, because we finished at the Martello Tower. This one's at Eastbourne, never used in anger. These were Napoleonic. The Royal Navy nicked the idea from when they tried to bash down a tower at Martello in Corsica, but failed to do so they liked the design. On the top would have been a huge gun with a 360-degree rotation. There's hundreds of these knocking about the place now. So we finished there in our story in Capture the Castle, but I thought at the time, that's a good idea. And perhaps that's another show. And when I discovered that they'd been described, pillbox had been described as 20th century castles, I thought, I'm doing that show. And the result is concrete castles. And here is a Northumbrian lozenge-shaped pillbox on the coast there with Dunstable medieval castle, a great gatehouse built by the Earl of Lancaster as a rival to Bamborough up the road in the background. That's the link there. The first working title I had for the show was Island Fortress, but I wasn't happy with that really, and one or two artists didn't like it, didn't give the right connotation. And driving around one day, the idea suddenly came to me. Concrete castles, wow, that'll do the trick, that's fantastic. I found out later that Julian had already painted some pillboxes. He'd already done it, that's why he asked. Beautiful things. Sadly, he's not in this exhibition. So the exhibition, opened in 2020, summer 2021, down at the Cornwall's Regimental Museum in Bodmin. This is one of the rooms in the military barracks there in Bodmin. It's a great building, split into several rooms. And this actually is its fourth venue. It then travelled to Coles Hill National Trust, part of the Buscott estate between Oxford and Swindon, and it's part of our story because it's where they trained the auxiliaries in the war. We might get some of that a bit later on. That's where they trained the auxiliaries. The big house burnt down in the 1950s, I think, but the stable block and the grounds, a lot of dog walkers go there, and we have put a little show next to the cafe, which went very well. I gave this talk there. And then last year, 2023, it was at Monmouth Museum all year. It's come down here. And 2 or 3 weeks after I installed the show with Rebecca here, with my co-curator Lisa Traxler, and in fact that first slide I showed you of the bunker is where she used to live on the Isle of Wight. A bit more about that later. That's one of the sculptures. 2 or 3 weeks after we installed the show last January, I got an email from the head of museums at Gravesend. Could they have the show? So it's going on. One artist said, well, it's a bit like the Mousetrap. It'll go on forever. It's an unusual show. It's interesting. It's different. And I think that's probably the appeal. But I tell you about the Romantic period and the artists coming to rediscover these objects, because I think that's, in a small way, what we've done to the pillboxes and fortifications that we've discovered in this country that still, survive from those dark days in 1940. Are we, they've been forgotten about, one of them have become ruinous. We drive past them, walk past them without second thought. They're not protected. Now, us artists, are we putting them back on the map so that one day they probably will be protected? Some are looked after very well. But the other thing about ruins, artists have always loved ruins because it marks the passage of time, but it also denotes that things change. And that's double-edged because it's optimistic, things will be better, they'll change in the future. But also, the flip side is that what we love around us now one day will be a ruin. So artists are it appeals to artists. Right, war art. In 1917, a 14-year-old boy was taken to Burlington House, the Royal Academy, to see an exhibition of war art, which had been commissioned by Lord Beaverbrook for the Canadian government. It was the first time that he'd seen contemporary art, and it made a deep and lasting impression upon him. Just a year before, he turned up at Winchester College for his education, where he would start to forge an exceptional knowledge and understanding of art and history, and an outstanding acumen for aesthetics, which would mark him as one of the formative figures of British culture of the last century. In 1934, he was appointed the youngest ever director of the National Gallery. He was Kenneth Clark. On the very day that war broke out, 3rd of September 1939, he marched round to the Treasury with that, as he wrote later, with that 1917 exhibition in his mind, and he said, "Can I start a war art scheme?" He was told yes. He thought later, with bad times, he would have been turned down. But he was off the mark straight away. He'd have been a busy boy. Just the day before, he'd waved off the last of the National Gallery collection on a train going at 20 miles an hour up to North Wales for their safekeeping. All the major museum collections were taken out of London, and the regional galleries as well. Southampton went to Wickham Park House up in Northamptonshire. And his... So for art and the war, it was cometh the hour, cometh the man. Just as it would be for the nation, with Winston Churchill, who on the 10th of May 1940 was appointed Prime Minister after Neville Chamberlain. And of course he was an artist too. And when he was asked if he would cut funding in order to support the war, he did not say, as some people think, then what are we fighting for? But he did say, the arts are essential to any complete national life. The state owes it to itself to sustain and encourage them. Of course, he was a champion for art. Clark's scheme would share similarities with its predecessor of the First World War, but the scope, type and quantity of work that was achieved would be very different indeed. Now, art as war has always been a subject for artists. This is a masterpiece in the National Gallery, the Battle of San Romano by Paolo Uccello of 1432. And such luminaries as Leonardo, Michelangelo, Dürer, Bruegel, Rubens, Velázquez, David, Goya and Delacroix have all depicted war. So when World War I broke out, the artists were there. But the first efforts were unrealistic, they were jingoistic, often religious, anachronistic. This is James Butler, Blood and Iron. And they had more akin to the Napoleonic Wars and this new mechanised industrial horrific warfare of the Western Front. But when young progressive artists who'd been served in the forces came back to Britain on leave and started to exhibit paintings from their first-hand experience of the trenches, the public sat up. And this culminated in the exhibition of Eric Kennington's The Kensingtons at Laventie in 1916. Charles Masterman, the director of the Propaganda Bureau, sat up and took notice and thought, I can harness this for the war effort. And after some advice from veteran artist William Rothenstein, he started an official state war art scheme, the first, never unprecedented, never been done before, the state commissioning contemporary art for the benefit of the nation, brand new. In 1917, such big names now, artists such as Christopher Nevinson, Paul Nash, William Orpen, Eric Kennington, John Lavery and others were appointed and commissioned into the army as war artists and were sent off to the front. Early in 1918, responsibility for the war artists passed from the Department of the Information to the British War Memorials Committee, whose main aim is to create a lasting memorial to the war. And then works passed the new Imperial War Museum, who were already commissioning their own artists. It was an unprecedented scheme, and it covered every aspect of war: violence, industry, social and economic changes, the war at sea, air and land. The plan was to build a hall of remembrance, but it was never built because Sir Alfred Mond MP was who sort of killed that idea off in Parliament, or championed that, was the great keen advocate of the new Imperial War Museum. He didn't want it to have a rival. Art, they thought, was seen as a means to convey Britain's righteous cause, to bear witness to the experience of war, to remember the fallen, and to provide effective propaganda. And the images they produce continue to shape our interpretation of the war. But a new pictorial language was required to show the realities of the horrors of the Western trenches. And abstraction, cubism, futurism came to the fore. So this work by Percy Wyndham Lewis, became an abstract painter, one of the vorticists, travelled in France. He was out in the front, joined the Royal Artillery, give this a rather inhuman, mechanised appearance to his figures, conveyed the sense much better than conventional means. And Christopher Nevinson's La Mitrailleuse conveys the machine gunner as a machine, a killing machine, which is considerably quite euphoric. And some of his works actually were censored by the government when he tried to show them back in London. And of course, the most famous painting, probably of all, of the First World War is Paul Nash's We Are Making a New World, which is in the Tate. Paul Nash writes about life on the Western Front. And he was in the Artist Rifles, then joined the Hampshire Regiment, fell into a trench, damaged it, broke a hip, had to be invalided out, and went back to the front as a war artist in 1917. He said, "It is unspeakable, godless, hopeless. I am no longer an artist interested and curious. I'm a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever. Feeble, inarticulate will be my message, but it will have a bitter truth, and may it burn their lousy souls." He actually had a breakdown in the 1920s when he was living down at Dymchurch on the south coast. He said, "I'm a war artist without a war." But he was to become one of the foremost of the World War II artists. And Clark said of Totes Meer, which is a sea of desolate, wrecked Luftwaffe aircraft brought together in one dump, that's the best war painting yet. So, he made his mark in both wars. Sadly died in 1946, suffered from bronchial asthma, and died young. So Britain actually was the only country that did war art. An extraordinary achievement, down to Clark alone. France only made records after the war, because they were, of course, under the Nazi cosh. Germany just did propaganda. Italy, virtually no war art at all survives. And the Americans, the USA, curiously only commissioned commercial artists. And it's through Clark's amazing achievement alone that he produced nearly 6,000 works of art. The best works of World War I were not surpassed, but a greater variety of style as subject. And the war affected the artists who were employed in the scheme. It changed their lives. Many had travelled for the first time abroad. Graham Sutherland had never been to France, for instance. And the war affected how they would work in the future, which I think a lot of people forget. And I think extraordinary fact is that for these artists were bohemians. They're not used to discipline. They had to don military uniform, salute, take military discipline to produce the works they did. But it worked. Clark's idea got off a very good start, thanks to, as he said, two advantages. One, he could run the scheme through the Ministry of Information, of which he was already a senior member. He described it as a perfectly useless body, badly led, full of oddballs. It had 5 functions: release of official news, censorship of the press, films and radio, maintaining morale, creating publicity campaigns like, Alls Have Ears, that sort of thing, and propaganda. It was nicknamed the Ministry of Aggravation. Clark would share a bewildering variety of short-lived committees, and some bright wag at the top thought because he looked after pictures, we'll put him in charge of the film division. He later was appointed controller of home publicity, so he became a really senior member, and he could use that infrastructure for his scheme. Secondly, he secured for his secretary an outstanding character in E.M. O'Rourke Dickey, who was an artist but also a bureaucrat and a fellow member of the Ministry of Information, and his accuracy and attention to detail will ensure that the scheme was extremely well run. How should the artist be chosen? Clarke decided to have 4 clients: the Air Ministry, the Admiralty, the War Office and the Home Office. So each had a representative on the committee, which meant that they could arrange permits and access to places for the artists where they were appointed. Also, it kept out other official bodies he didn't want anywhere near him, like the Royal Academy, for instance. And he said repeatedly that the War Artists Advisory Committee, as this body became known, WAAC, would show to posterity what the war felt like. Because he said there are certain things in life so serious that only a poet can tell the truth about them. Artistic merit was to be the criterion for acceptance in the scheme or rejection, not illustrative accuracy. And this would have produced all sorts of arguments, and it certainly did with the Air Ministry, about who was good, who was in, and what should be accepted. But a major unspoken aim for Clarke was giving employment to artists whose source of employment had dried up, commissions, art schools closing down and so on, but also keeping them safe and keeping them alive, because so many artists have been killed in the trenches. But for 3 artists in particular, this aim failed fatally, as we shall see. The terms of reference were to draw up a list of artists qualified to record the war at home and abroad, to work in cooperation with the service departments and other government departments as may be desirable, to advise on selection of artists from this list for war purposes and the arrangement for their employment, and to advise on copyright, disposal and art and exhibitions of works and the publications of reproductions. The first meeting of the War Artists Advisory Committee was on the 23rd of November 1939. He got off a very early start, with Kenneth Clarke in the chair. There were 197 weekly meetings in all, and the last one was in December 1945. The construction of the committee remained broadly the same, with some changes of service personnel. It was almost impossible for artists to operate outside of this scheme because access was given to areas where they could not otherwise go to. But some artists certainly did produce some important works. Like in World War I, artists were given honorary commissions, the committee or the state acquiring their works in return for a salary, or they received agreed fees for specific commissions. And for World War II, with Clarke's committee, the same protocols were kept, although most were for specific commissions. Early on, artists complained the fact that they were kept away from the front where they wanted to be, but at the end of the war, it was access all areas. They could go wherever they want. At the first meeting, it was agreed there would be a few full-time artists, so lots of specific conditions, and permits would be given to those who applied on their own initiative. The first list was drawn up, contained about 50 artists they were asked to join the scheme, mostly predictable, including World War I veterans, eminent Royal Academicians, and leading portrait painters. There were some women. This, for instance, is Ethel Gabain, born in France, painting the Blitz. She's rather well dressed, I think, for the occasion, don't you think? Subject categories included portraits, figures in action, landscapes, sea and shipping, sky and aeroplanes, towns, and factory interiors. At the following meeting, there was a letter from the Treasury read out, sanctioning the appointment of 1 portrait painter for the War Office, 1 general painter, 1 etcher, 1 black and white artist, each to be offered an honorary commission and salary of £650 per annum. Mostly the meetings were routine matters: control and dispersal of artists, suggestion of subjects, selection of works to purchase, and anybody could submit, an amateur could submit a work to be accepted by the committee, curating exhibitions, vetting new applications, copyright issues, uniforms, materials, fees, travel expenses, permits, and clothing coupons. There are 14 bound volumes of minutes, which make very interesting readings. A lot of humour in there, interesting stuff going on. And you can see all the arguments between the services and Clarke and his more artistically leaned personnel about the inaccuracy of artists depicting the machinery. In 1939 to 40, the state spent 5,000 on purchase of works of art. The following year went up to 8,000, the year after that, 41, 42, to 14,000. Then it reduced annual grant to 1945. And here is a group of war artists in 1941 in Tobruk, and you can see they're not very warrior-like. They look a bit sort of arty, don't they? So now we're going to look at some of the artists who painted home defences. The first is Albert Richards. He started out as a sapper. This is along the south coast. He then wanted to be a parachuter, so he ended up parachuting into D-Day with the 6th Airborne Division and joined the Second Army on its push into Germany. But he had a penchant for driving around in his Jeep where he shouldn't go, and sadly, in 1944, late 44, on the Dutch-German border, his Jeep ran over a mine. He was blown up and killed. So he was killed on active service. One of the most famous of the war artists was Eric Villiers. He's waiting to be called up. And he says, the war artist scheme is a good one. If ever they start it, I've heard no more. But he eventually joins the Navy, sent up to the Northern Waters and joins the Battle of Norway. He paints some astonishing paintings up there, and then comes back to Portsmouth, where the CNC there, Admiral James, who incidentally is the grandson of the great painter, pre-Raphaelite artist Millet, who became President of the Royal Academy, and he is the subject. His nickname is Bubbles because he's the subject as a grandson of that famous painting by Millet that became a Pear's advertisement for Pear's soap, and it amused Revilius that his nickname was still Bubbles. And James suggested he painted the coastal defences around Britain. So he went to Newhaven on the south coast, later up to Rosyth and Dundee, and then he was appointed to become an artist in Iceland. And the day he arrived there, an aircraft had gone missing, and he joined the following day an air-sea rescue mission of 3 aircraft. But his aircraft failed to return, and he was lost at sea. It was thought that the engines froze up, and they, 1 or 2 were lost. So it was a huge tragedy that Eric Villiers, who's one of the most popular painters, certainly between the wars, in watercolour, he got an Art Deco feel, sense of design. He designed all sorts of things, including ceramics and graphic material, distinctive style, almost sort of semi-abstract. A great artist was lost. So the second artist who painted these scenes lost his life for his art. This is a painting of Barnet Friedman, dressed, and this is probably a propaganda photo because there he is dressed in full uniform, painting the scene before him. And he joined the war artist scheme and painted the coastal defences along Kent. John Nash writes to his brother, he says, Friedman still works on vast paintings of guns and gun emplacements and seems really happy. So these artists were drawn to the big guns. That was the big subject that attracted them. And later he joined the Navy and went around the world painting subjects for them. Edward Ardisoni, who by this time, Italian extraction, was well known as a children's illustrator, Tiny Tim books, I remember I had one of those, and was hugely prolific as a war artist. He said, this, as you can imagine, was a wonderful moment for me. I did not know at the time that war artists were being appointed. I had not applied or lobbied for any such job. It came as a complete surprise. I was to go to France and really see the war and do my own civilian job, which was put down on paper what I saw and felt instead of being a rather inefficient officer in the mud of a gun site in South London. And again, it's the big gun that's attracted him. He actually goes off to France with a British expeditionary force, so he has to come back through Dunkirk. Prolific contributor to the War Artist scheme. He later goes on to Normandy, right into Germany. So he saw a lot of the war in different theatres. Anthony Gross, who was commissioned to do drawings of guards' barracks at Caterham and at Catterick, and on training manoeuvres. He spent 10 days at Dover recording defences, including the big 14-inch guns pointing at Calais, named Winnie and Pooh, which actually were spares for King George V battleship. And in 1941, he was posted to North Africa and met Ardizoni out there, and later went on to Burma and also Normandy. So another great traveller. I mean, they saw the world, these guys. And again, he's attracted to the big gun on coastal defences. And a woman, Ray Howard-Jones, had been to Slade School of Art, a young woman. She writes to Kenneth Clark. She wants to cover the Merchant Navy, doing works at the docks at Cardiff. But these were rejected by the Royal WAAC and later censored for some reason. However, later submissions of her works were accepted. The fortifications on Flatholm and Steepholm Islands in the Bristol Chapel, and this is one, so lovely colourful painting. Other artists using coastal defences were Roland Pitchforth, Terence Cuneo, the guy who used the sort of artefact of a mouse in his paintings, and Stephen Bone. The WAAC were keen to receive works from artists who had practical and first-hand experience of their subjects. So now let's look to the show that we have here now. So Lisa Traxler, with her grand design architect husband Lincoln, in fact, he's been on that TV programme, bought an old World War II site on the south coast of the Isle of Wight. It was a radar station, chain home station, St Lawrence, and the bunker, which is the first image I showed you, was the concrete bunker for the generator. And this influenced her work as a sculptor. She's interested in the shapes of these defence structures and also camouflage, because it was camouflaged at the time. The radar mast is gone now. And during lockdown specifically, she was working with her great-uncle's war letters, talking about home, wanting to come home. So these connections influenced her art. So these are some of the sculptures that she came up with in the exhibition. And this actually this work is in the show, a little lino cut print. This Nissen Hunt is her studio, was her studio, and you can see the English Channel beyond. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. They've sadly now left there. And the Nissen Hut on the right was her husband Lincoln's architectural studio as well. So working in these old buildings must have been great fun. But the pillboxes and these structures, they do have sculptural properties. They are attracting to artists today. And we had 2 or 3 works by, not in this current show, in the first show, which was a larger exhibition, included 2 or 3 sculptures, they're not very big, these things, by sculptors Jim Shepherd and India Dickinson, using the shapes that they could see in defence structures. This is cast concrete, as sort of standalone sculptures. Another work not in this current show is this painting by Ben Fenton, who's Kentish, and this is called the Dymchurch Grand Redoubt. So some previous defence structures were reinvented or redesigned to hold World War II structures. This is one such. And Ben says, there is something I find particularly melancholic about the fact that it has been standing for 2 centuries, awaiting to fulfil its purpose, a utilitarian, brutal, forgotten edifice that I thought thoroughly beautiful and enchanting. I think it gives that sort of, conveys that sort of message quite nicely. But in my search for artists who paint these structures, I discovered 1 or 2 who major on them. Dick Hewitson, who lives in Poole, he's a retired biology teacher, lovely guy. He paints these ad infinitum, he loves them. Glorious, because they've got some, there's some sort of mystery about them. They're enigmatic, they're sculptural, they're slightly sinister, not very beautiful, but they have an attraction that appeals greatly. He's a great, good, really good painter. And Philippa Beale here. Now, I knew her in the 1980s when she was a feminist conceptual artist. And like many conceptual artists, they always return to painting, because it's such a therapeutic, gorgeous way. And this is a great painting of a remains of some defence structure, some bunker just off the side of a main road in Kent. She'd never have painted this unless I'd asked her for this show. And I think it's a gorgeous, gorgeous painting. And then my friend Richard Bavin, who's heavily into ecology, works for wildlife trusts, loves birds. This painting is of Minsmere, the wildlife reserve in Suffolk, where of course on the east coast there are lots of defence structures. So it's got that sort of rather strange, lovely sunset and moonlit depiction of anti-tank traps in the bird reserve. And I've been there, and there's quite a few structures there that relate to these times. The most abstract we went was Jeremy Gardner here, who paints the Jurassic Coast. He was on the verge of, he's a very well-known artist, on the verge of becoming a Royal Academician, semi-abstract. He loves geology, so all his works, he puts down paint, other materials, scrapes them back. It's about archaeology, if you like, as well. So this is the Dorset coast, and you can see the beach here with the pillbox, because they're there. Pillbox is in the painting because it's in the structure. And just to counter that, to finish, we have something very representational, lovely paint, watercolour, traditional watercolour, by Pete Jarvis, who taught illustration at Solent University. And he's an very well-known architectural illustrator. Verbatim, this is what the structure looks like, with its barbed wire fence. Right, so finally, I'm going to, in the last few minutes, 10 minutes or so, talk about the history side of our subject. Now, when I was planning the catalogue here, I always knew I wanted to write a history essay, just to give some context to the exhibition. And at the beginning, I didn't quite know how or why. I'm quite widely read on the subject, but quite quickly, the plan fell into place. I ended up with 9 short chapters, and the headings are Britain Alone, ? Churchill and Roosevelt, the Ironside Plan, pillboxes, the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, the Home Front, British ingenuity. For instance, there was a plan to set the sea on fire with a huge stocks of petrol and oil. Bonkers ideas they come up with, huge ingenuity. The Germans and how bad they were, and finally the demise of Operation Sea Lion. I've only got time to get the first 3 across to you now, if I can do that. But I'll give you some sort of context. And I wrote it I had the time in lockdown 2. I didn't have a good time in lockdown 1, but by the time the second one came around, I worked out how to do it. And I enjoyed that time writing this essay. And I wrote 11,500 words, the longest I'd ever written for an exhibition or a book. And I thoroughly enjoyed the process. It was widely believed, still widely believed, that after the embarkation of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk at the end of May 1940, and my father was there. He was Royal Army Service Corps, age 21, captain, and he got off the beaches May 28th on a paddle steamer. I've got his memoirs. So he was on those beaches, which I visited last year for the first time. And it's said that the Germans could have walked into Britain, so parlous were our defences. But at the end of August, the Soviet ambassador, after a 2-day tour, writes home impressed. This place, effectively, he's saying, this place is an armed camp. No one's going to get in here. What had happened in the intervening weeks to put on these new defences is quite mind-boggling to contemplate. Was Britain alone? Well, the Germans were certainly not planning an invasion. First of all, they've got to finish off France. It wasn't on their radar. But also, they almost entirely didn't have the means to do so. And Admiral Radar certainly knew that. To combat the Royal Navy would be almost an impossible task, because the Kriegsmarine was so bashed up after the Battle of Norway, all their many losses could not be replaced. And the fact, hindsight reveals that Britain, the idea that Britain was defenceless and ripe for the plucking by a huge Nazi machine is a complete myth. and that German indecision, disunity, ignorance, self-delusion and utter incompetence was matched with British determination, clarity of vision, ruthless efficiency and cunning ingenuity. And Britain was not really alone either. It had the huge resources and manpower of its overseas dominions. Canada, Australia, the Indian Raj, New Zealand, South Africa and Burma, and 50 crown colonies, overseas territories, dependencies, mandates, protectorates, and Hong Kong, Singapore, Malta and Gibraltar to fall back on. Britain was still a massive global maritime power. Churchill knew this. He had great geopolitical knowledge and experience. And Britain had the industrial capacity, technical know-how and resources to fight the war effectively after the huge shock of the fall of France had decided. That was a psychological blow, that the largest army in the world had fallen within weeks to the Nazi war machine. That was the huge shock that Britain had to get over. Churchill in 1942 was to regale to the Canadian Parliament Marshal Pétain and his general's prophecy that within 3 weeks Britain would have its neck wrung like a chicken. And after a short pause he said, "Some chicken, some neck." The miracle or the deliverance of Dunkirk saved 330,000 Allied troops over 8 days using 800 ships. Only the Royal Navy could have done this operation with the resources and legacy and know-how. But over 60% of the equipment was left behind. Churchill quipped, "We've got the men away, but we've left the luggage," including 2,400 guns, 615 tanks, and 63,000 vehicles. Here are the Germans surveying that dump. A paper entitled "British Strategy in event of a certain eventuality," i.e. the fall of France, was dusted down. And General Tiny Ironside was appointed C&C Home Forces. He was to replace the elderly General Walter Kirk, whose Operation Julius Caesar, to defend the island, was deemed obsolete. So he had a difficult job because he had no weapons, or very few weapons, and he galvanised his resources. The beaches very soon within 5 miles of ports on the south and east coasts were sown with 50,000 miles, anti-tank scaffolding, coiled wire, roadblocks, barricades, pillboxes, trenches, machine gun nests. Fields were strewn with obstacles, bizarre types of obstacles to prevent aircraft landing. And major ports were issued with 6-inch naval gun batteries. It was thought by military thinkers that a possible lightning attack by stormtroopers in fast boats at night might occur, with up to 30,000 paratroops being dropped behind the lines to sow confusion and disrupt counter-activity. And some Germans actually advocated the fact that now's the time to strike before Britain could rearm and react to an invasion. Another initiative, which we'll hear a bit later on now today, was the formation of what became known as the local defence volunteers. These were recruited from civilians to boost troop numbers. Those in protected employment or too young or too old to fight. Many were World War I veterans. Churchill, ever the romantic, didn't like the title and changed the title to Home Guard, ever immortalised by Dad's Army on the BBC. 300,000 troops were soon raised, but they had at start no weapons, but they manned the static defences which left the regular army for mobile operations. By early June, Ironside had just 14 divisions, undertrained, under-equipped, each around 13,800 men. Each had about between 12 and 15 field guns instead of the regulation 72, and only 33 anti-tank guns. They'd all been 2-pounders, small guns, in total. A ramp-up of arms production was vital. But that Churchill was still able to send Hurricane aircraft to Malta, which was being attacked, and tanks to North Africa, gives the lie to the fact that the situation was entirely desperate. It was not. On the 10th of May, the day that the Nazis invaded the Low Countries, Belgium and Norway, Churchill replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister, who had lost the confidence of the nation after the debacle of the Battle of Norway and his appeasement policies in the 1930s. Churchill said he had a mountain to climb. He said, I can only offer blood, sweat, toil and tears. But he was actually energised by war. And to boost public morale, which was in danger of sliding away, he then gave a series of extraordinary, uplifting speeches, which are now famous. Hitler knows he must break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, then all Europe might be free. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall never surrender. And if the British Empire was to last 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. The English language had been mobilised for war. It was good versus evil, and morale stiffened. George VI was not alone in feeling relief that Britain no longer needed to succour France. And one taxi driver, in response to a passenger despondent saying, "Oh, we've had it now, we're all alone," said, "Oh no, it's all right, sir. We're in the final now, and we're going to play on the home ground." Churchill's position, however, at this time was not secure. He faced opposition from Lord Halifax here, who was his foreign secretary. He was the darling of the Tories. Churchill was seen by many at this stage as a reckless adventurer, and they didn't like him. His tenure was not safe. Halifax wanted to put out peace feelers after the debacle of the fall of France and Dunkirk through the Italian embassy and Ciano, the foreign ministry. And there was a 3-day tense battle of wills between Churchill and Halifax. And on May the 28th, the crisis possibly came closest to the UK losing the war. But Churchill comprehensively outmanoeuvred Halifax, saying nations that go down fighting would rise again, whereas those that capitulated would not. And we could not win better terms if we sued for peace than if we were defeated in battle. Napoleon, he said, was told there are bitter weeds in England. That the British Expeditionary Force was saved through the evacuation from Dunkirk was critical to his plan to fight on. One day, Churchill was shaving at Admiralty House, where he was still living, on the 18th of May, and he said to his son Randolph, who was standing next to him, he said, "I think I see my way through. I shall drag the United States in." The hitherto isolationist United States of America, with Roosevelt the president, was the largest and most powerful economy in the world at this time. Only the USA, believed Churchill, could provide salvation from the present desperate situation. He never let up in his appeal to Roosevelt, his argument being that if Britain fell, the USA would be next in the firing line for the Nazis, and the chance of Western democracy and culture disappearing was very real. Roosevelt was sympathetic, but he was bound by the Neutrality Act. He could only offer warm words, but using his politics, he worked on public opinion. He sent observers, Averell Harriman and Harry Hopkins, to find out what was going on and tell him what was going on. No help at all from the ambassador at the time, Joseph Kennedy, who was a complete defeatist, who was soon replaced. In June, Roosevelt did a armed stock take, and the subsequent surplus of 500,000 rifles of World War I vintage, 900 howitzers, 22,000 machine guns were designated for sale to the UK. But it was illegal to sell arms to belligerent nations. So very cleverly, they sold these arms to the private US steel company, who then sold them on to the UK for 37.6 million. It wasn't going to be for free. They were going to make money out of it. And 600 freight trains were brought to New Jersey, loaded day and night onto UK merchant ships so that they could get them back to the UK in good time. Canada also offers 75,000 Ross rifles of vintage. So the defensive capabilities of the home forces were then transferred. And through Lend-Lease, 50 old mothball destroyers were given in exchange for US naval bases across UK dominions. So Ironside came up with a plan to resist what they thought would be a Nazi invasion, to construct a series of inland strongpoints to stop the Nazis from running amok after their initial breakthrough. And he delivered his 3-point plan called GHQ Operating Instructions Number 3 on the 13th of June to the War Cabinet. Firstly, there would be a lightly held coastal crust from the Wash to New Haven. Over 20,000 tons of concertina wire were used alone in June, and gun batteries, Winnie and Pooh, were installed in Dover and other batteries around the country. Pillboxes. And this is a Type 24 pillbox. The most common held 8 soldiers and a machine gun. The Directorate of Fortifications and Works, with their 1 to 49 fortifications, came up with 9 designs for pillboxes, the largest being the Type 28, which held a 2-pounder gun. And they built an astonishing 28,000 pillboxes during the war. And often civilian firms would be commissioned, contracted to do these, and one firm built 200 over a 3-year period up 50 miles of coastline. They worked day and night. Royal Engineers would liaise with the contractors and with the defending soldiers about sighting, camouflage, and it was a huge operation. The pouring was in 2 parts over precast embrasures, a bit like B&Q, where you can buy windows at B&Q, which were made at Railway Engineering Works at Eastleigh in Hampshire, Ashford in Kent. So the pourings are around the embrasures. It was an astonishing industry. And this is one of the big guns in Dover. Secondly, there would be a series of stop lines, continuous anti-tank barriers using canals, rivers, forests, escarpments, with field works and concrete defences to boost them up. And the large of these was called the GHQ line. And thirdly, behind the GHQ line would be stationed a mobile reserve of just only 3 divisions, 3 infantry divisions, and the 1st Armoured Division to react to any invasion that happened and move towards it. The principal GHQ line, you can see in red, runs from the Bristol Channel across the Somerset Levels, up the Kent and Avon Canal, lots of pillboxes there, to Reading, across to Farnham, across the North Downs to Penshurst, up the Medway towns, across the Thames at Canvey Island, up to Chelmsford and Cambridge, and as far north as Stamford, the River Welland. There's a notional line from up to Richmond and Edinburgh and beyond into Scotland, but they only planned the demolition of bridges for this part. The plan to flood the Romney Marshes by emptying the Royal Military Canal was never carried out. The additional stop lines were carried out at junior command level lines. There was the Taunton stop line, which you can see here from just above Bridgewater down to Seaton. There was the Salisbury East command line from Wiltshire down to Portsmouth, the Scottish command line, the Welsh command line, the East Anglian command line. These filled gaps and made interlocking boxes in which to trap the enemy. They were to be channeled and defeated piecemeal. That was the plan. But when Ironside presented his plan to the War Cabinet, it was rejected by Churchill and also by General Alan Brooke, who'd had a good campaign in Northwest Europe, in France, and was now in the ascendant. And Churchill and Brooke wanted to stop the troops digging ditches and to be training. They also thought it was a flawed strategy, introducing sort of Maginot Line defensive mentality, and they wanted a more mobile response and an aggressive response. Alan Brooke soon replaced Ironside and halted the defence building. So suddenly all our pillboxes are redundant. Extraordinary story. He demolished all the roadblocks that would have hindered his armoured manoeuvres. His new policy was to create a network of nodal points around towns, water and road junctions with all-round protection. And he also pressed for an increased productivity of arms and vehicles. So that's as far as I've got time to, the hour's up, to tell you about the extraordinary story of Britain in 1940. Tomorrow is Battle of Britain Day. 15th of September. We all know the end of the story, but at the time they didn't know. They were expecting an invasion. And of course, one thing the Germans did agree on was they had to secure mastery of the skies, which they failed to do because we won the Battle of Britain, depicted here by this great painting by Paul Nash. So I'm ending with a work of art. Thank you.
Really fantastic talk, Tim. Thank you ever so much. Part historical contextualisation.
And lots of art.
And lots of art. Any questions?
I'd just like to agree with you about, I think Ironside gets a really bad deal.
Yeah, he does.
I think Ironside's strategy was at a point where he had no mobile
Yeah,
reserve,
yeah.
and actually the pillboxes would have played it's like an Iron Age hill fort. You're pushing the attackers in the way you want to utilise your mobile reserve most effectively. By the time Brooke came over, he had many more vehicles, many more tanks, because of the huge increase in industrial capability. So I think Ironside gets a really hard deal. So I'm pleased to see that he was bigged up.
I bigged him up, yeah. Well, he'd been CIGS. He was a well-known figure. They had confidence in him. And you're right, he had no option but to use. I'm sorry I didn't have to give the chapter on pillboxes, because that's a fascinating story. I just give a hint of that there. But in fact, by 1942, they were deemed redundant. The idea being that they attracted fire, and the fact. The issue is that you have to have a tiny embrasure for protection, but you couldn't see out, you couldn't see what's happening. So they said if you're attacked, you actually get out the pillbox and hide in the ditches you built below. There was a conflict between pillboxes. But there's still so many around. They destroyed a lot at the end of the war, but there's still thousands around of all these different types. So yes, Ironside is, yes, he did get a bad deal, thank you.
May I ask?
Yeah.
Is there a favourite fortification that you've seen, maybe in person or from the...
Fortification?
Yeah.
Well, you're going back to medieval castles now.
But from
I think first sight of a great medieval castle is jaw-dropping. It's power and awe, because that's what they were built for. Conway's one of my favourites. These little pillboxes, sometimes the most wonderful are the ones you come across by accident. They're hidden in the hedgerows. I've seen them. Wow, what's that? It's been hidden for months, yeah. But there's so many around us. Hidden histories. That's why I love doing these art shows around hidden histories.
Anybody else?
So you spoke a lot about war artists.
Yeah.
War photographers, were they
Ah.
a kind of conflict between the two, or were they...
No. I mean, nowadays, we're still... What I didn't say was, at the end of the war, the state had realised that they had commissioned and supported artists, contemporary artists, for the benefit of the nation. In 1946, the Arts Council is formed. Direct cause and effect. And who's the first chair? Kenneth Clark. Nowadays, they're still sending war artists out, as a matter of course. All from Clark. It's down to Clark. It's an amazing achievement that he achieved all of this. And nowadays, artists work across media. They'll work with photography and with painting, or other media, digital media. They're using modern technology, artists. And now it's all merged as one. But in those days, it was separate. The war photographer, that'd be another talk, amazing talk. Kappa, people like that, fantastic. Lee Miller, there's going to be a new film on Lee Miller coming out. Amazing war photographer. And of course, she married Roland Penrose, the great surrealist, who was Picasso's biographer. So all those they're all linked in. But of course, they're conveying different messages as well. But for me, it's all one. It's all art, yeah. The visual arts.
So are you an artist yourself?
Yeah. I'm in the show. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Some works you can show?
It's you can see one. Yeah, I did 4 actually. But there's only one in this show. And it's if you go up to Northumberland, the place is strewn with concrete cubes. I think they use them for picnic tables now. They're still there, massive, these anti-tank. And the pattern, the sculpture, that's what I painted, the pattern making thing really. So, concrete. When I spoke to the printer about this book, he was in Bristol, he said, I thought the book was about concrete. In fact, they ran out of concrete. They had to reduce the mix and sink them into the floor, have thinner walls at the back. They ran out of wooden shuttering, so they had to use bricks instead. They're left in place, which you can say pillboxes made of brick, because that's just the shuttering. The story is amazing.